17 more slides on this one, and I have another presentation after, and then another one after that. So we got a lot to get through. With that, the sixth and final presentation should be a little shorter, so we're going to leave time for questions. So if you have some questions, obviously I welcome them. I love the questions, but we're going to wait after this one. And then on the next one, if you stick around, gracious enough to still be listening to me, then we will have a Q&A after the sixth and final one. So with this, I announced this yesterday, but these are just QR codes for some of the books that I recommend for sex and sexual things and sexual struggles and addictions and things like that. A lot of great resources specifically for sexual addiction, porn addiction, but some good stuff there. For 2 books on just understanding sexuality, Rethinking Sexuality from Julie Slattery Dr. Julie Slattery is amazing. Holy Sexuality in the Gospel from Christopher Yuan is really, really good. TINSA is for trauma-induced sexual addiction. And then if anybody's interested in the IFS work, No Bad Parts is kind of the key book for IFS that we talked about yesterday. So I'm going to put those over here. If anybody's interested, feel free to scan the QR codes, look through the books. Those are my personal copies, so as I said yesterday, go gentle. But yeah, feel free to look through them. So technically we still have a minute. We're going to hop right in. Just turned 2:45. Perfect. Okay. We had talked about yesterday, we've been working through the intimacy pyramid, right? We've talked about some of the spiritual understanding of sex. We've talked about the emotional understanding of sex, what the emotional wounds that cause us to basically not have fantastic sex lives, and how that enters into the marriage, that enters into our relationships through attachment wounds, right, through identity, and through internal family systems, kind of working through those wounds. And so we came to the head part, the intellectual, the knowledge of understanding sex better, understanding sex from an intellectual perspective. And we started this by looking yesterday at the 4 different generations with the Gen Zs, the Millennials, the Gen Xers, and which I think I have on the last slide. And there we go, baby boomers. And with those years and how each one kind of contributed to how we now view sex, what we associate sex with, some of the things or the ways that we view it. So Gen Z is majorly into LGBTQ. Millennials are, but they're more that's like hookup culture, is kind of millennials. Gen X are those who seemingly out of duty stay in their poor marriages, the marriages that just they're not pleasurable, they're not fun, they're not nice to be in, and so a lot of them end up divorcing after their kids head to college. And then you have baby boomers who also do some of the same, but they also were the ones that ushered in the gay manifesto, things like that, and feminism, which has really crept in, but they were the free love 60s, right, wild child. As you can tell, that would be the earlier baby boomers because the last of it was born in 64, so they grew up in the 70s. So this is throughout the years, and each one, again, has kind of played a role in how we understand sexuality today. So our sexual understanding doesn't happen in a vacuum where we're born and then all of a sudden that's what we know. We're coming with decades of different belief systems and different thoughts and different actions surrounding this idea of our sexuality. And so that's through the years with those generations. So we come down to, what does sex represent to us? It's no longer, if it ever was, a black and white thing. It represents a lot of things to a lot of people. So as we started with identity, we actually didn't finish all of identity, but we talked about how the LGBTQ movement is very much into identity. They define their identity basically is, at the core of it is identity. They define themselves rather by sexuality. At the core of it is sexuality, is their gender, right? We talked about how gender was John Money's term that he coined in 1955 to describe a human characteristic. It's a characteristic that can be changed on a whim, and so we're seeing a lot of that. So when they come out of this, when you have people who detransition, those who come out of homosexuality, they're very much looked down upon by the LGBTQ community because you're turning your back on your identity. I was identifying as transgendered. I'm no longer identifying as that, meaning the core of your identity is gone to these people. So it's a threat to them. And so that's where the church has to step in. We have to do a better job of being there for these people because it's in those moments that their identity is clearly fragile. We have to point them to the rock of Christ, right? So as we teach our kids and fellow adults about identity, we have to let them know that Defining themselves by their sexual preferences is shallow because sexual preferences are changeable. If it really is a characteristic or sexual preference, then one day you like this, the next day you like that. If that's at the core of your identity, it's not much of a core, is it? It's changing all the time. It's in flux. And so I'm convinced this is why they have such poor mental health in the LGBTQ circles. Their identity is in flux. They don't know who they are. They're really trying to get an understanding of this is what makes me, me. And they don't know how to. So they have to constantly be reaffirmed in their assertion that they are gay or they're bi or they're trans, and if they can get you to believe it, then it must be so, right? No. They're doing what we talked about of trying to get everybody else to buy into it and to agree and going from the outside in. And if they can force you through kicking you off of Twitter and through shaming you on Facebook and through all the TikTok posts and through just the workplace environment and all of the big corporations and companies supporting it, if they can get everybody to affirm this assertion that this is their identity, it must be their identity, right? Well, it's horrible because you're never going to get all people to believe all things at all times, nor should we. If their identity was solid, they'd have no reason to push for acceptance so much. It shows they are desperate to be affirmed that what they're doing is right because I think, according to Romans 1, I think they know it's wrong, personally. I think they know on a deep level this is not right, this is wrong, this is a perversion of what is intended to be. It's the same thing as atheists. A lot of atheists, and I think at the core of who they are, they know. I think that's what Romans 1 is speaking about. So we can debate all day long on this level. At the end of the day, when we're speaking to this and we're saying, what is your identity in? They don't have a deep understanding of what their identity is. It's no way to live life. That's why, again, I think their mental health is not very good at all. They constantly need that reaffirmation, which is not healthy. And as I mentioned yesterday, the mental health community, a lot of licensed professionals are very pro-LGBTQ. That is ridiculous. It is stupidity because we realize these people are struggling. And when we give them the cop-out that it's because they've been bullied, yes, some of them are bullied and it's not good and it's very sad with what they're having to go through. You know who bullies them even worse? Their own people when they come out of it. The bullying there is horrible. So we are not doing them any favors by saying that this is just an alternate lifestyle that's just as good. No, it's not. You're dying early, you have no sense of your identity, and sex represents the core of your being, which is not how it ought to be. Now, I think it's very easy, like I said out there, with the darkness, we can always talk about the world and the identity in the world. However, I think even in the church, we can define ourselves by our sexuality. Mm-hmm. How many women find their worth in their looks? How many men find their worth in how much sex they have or how sexually desirable they are? It's the same thing, right? In a way. Here's a quick litmus test. Can you as a woman go out in public without makeup, or would your self-esteem drop?
No problem.
Yeah.
Good work. Can you as a man go a couple of weeks without sex with your wife without your self-esteem dropping? Right? Those are quick litmus tests. We may not be defining ourselves by our sexual preferences, but it's easy to define ourselves by our sexual attractiveness or our libido. That is shallow as well. What happens if some tragedy happens and you can't have sex anymore? You get in a horrible car accident or something, right? What happens if you gain baby weight and you have a tough time getting it off? And your sexual attractiveness is what you define yourself by. What happens if you get old, you have the hormonal shift or whatever, your libido goes down? Well, I'm less of a man, or my self-esteem begins to drop, right? Sex is a gift from God, but it's not supposed to be at the core of our identity. It's okay to wear makeup, it's okay to desire sex with your wife, I'm not saying it's not. But just notice what is driving those things. What is pushing you toward those things? Is it because maybe your sexuality is really close to the center of who you are? Mm-hmm. Second, we have pleasure. What else is sex representing to us? And I think it's pleasure. And I think most people believe this is what the LGBTQ movement is all about, right? They just want to have fun with sex. In my opinion, I think that movement's driven way more by emotional wounds than they want to let on. But yes, there are those who in the world simply view sex as the fast track to pleasure. It is pleasurable. Pretending that it's not is lying. It is pleasurable. It's not near as pleasurable as it should be when we're doing it outside God's bounds, and then we end up with STDs and all sorts of things that are very not pleasurable. But a lot of people look at this as the fast track to pleasure, and I'd say this speaks most to those who are into one-night stands, right? They're chasing the pure pleasure of sex over and over, never realizing that you're never going to experience sex in all its glory because you're not ever being fully open with someone. They don't know you. You don't know them. So how is sex supposed to be good when you're just chasing the physical feeling of it? It is intended to be a glorious thing between a husband and wife, but they're unwilling to commit. They're unwilling to be truly intimate with someone, with the other person. We also see this with swingers clubs and those who engage in various sexual acts with multiple people. And I think many are actually moving away from the messiness of relationships and choosing self-pleasure with porn, even with sex dolls, with VR. That's a big thing these days, is VR. And they're saying, all sex is pleasure. If I could pleasure myself, why would I need the messiness of a relationship? Why would I need the emotional scars of a breakup? Why would I need to get married and then go through a messy divorce and have to split half of my stuff? If all I want out of a relationship is sex, I'll either do the one-night stand, and if I don't want even the emotional wounds there, then I will just stay at home in my house. So we have a lot of people doing that. Japan's got a huge problem with this right now. I'm blanking on the name, but there's guys that stay in their parents' house and in their basements for like into their 30s, and they will not get out. And it takes, the way they do it is sometimes not really humane, seeming like they take their rights. But they're afraid to go out and get into actual relationships with people. It's extreme social anxiety. Well, things like pornography create extreme social anxiety because of shame and such. Brain science shows us, on the pleasure scale, brain science shows us how dopamine works. How when you go through sex, there's adrenaline, there's dopamine, there's another one I can't pronounce. They all come together in the brain science portion of this, and it hijacks, or it has the ability to spike our dopamine receptors, and it floods us full of this amazing feeling that we have to chase again and again. And with porn has a supernormal stimuli, is what we call it, meaning the novelty and the eroticism of what you're watching is far beyond any woman can give, basically, because you can find whatever fetish or whatever thing that you want to get into, and so porn is supernormal stimuli. No woman can possibly compete with that. So it's very much like the person who injects heroin for the first time, and they're always chasing that first high. That's how porn works. You're always chasing that first high, the dopamine response that you get. And it creates a pleasure high, again, that can't be matched with regular sex. You think of it like this. Right, when we engage in either the ultra-sexual, like far out there sex that's very taboo, it spikes, and maybe the pleasure in the mind has hit a level that it has not hit before, but you also drop way down low. You always crash through. We have in our addiction work, we talk about the, why am I blanking on the term? Basically, you have your foundation, right? The nervous system, you have your foundation. And you engage in porn use to initially hit the foundation. You go into parasympathetic, you go up into sympathetic, which is sympathetic is like really angry, parasympathetic is depressed, called going dorsal. And we try to stay right in the foundation. Well, for here, like with porn, your spikes of dopamine, your spikes of pleasure may be higher than at other times. This is what it ought to look like, though. Sex in a marriage may not hit the spikes quite as high, but it's a much better life, right? You're not hitting the horrible lows that are supposed to, that take place with anything else. And so those who chase pleasure have to be willing to deal with the fact that your life will crash and burn at times. And those lows, you don't know how long you're going to stay in those lows. And you try to pull yourself out of the lows by going to sex again and recreating the high, and it's never enough. This is enough. You're staying above the line because you're in a committed relationship with someone that when you have sex, it's incredible, but you never get too low, because even in those lulls where you're not having sex and the pleasure isn't physically as good, you're still okay, right? You're still in a good place. God intended sex to be unbelievably enjoyable, but the mere act itself does not represent pleasure. Pleasure should come from these middle moments, right, of creating intimacy, the entire intimacy process, with sex being the overflow and the outcome of a pleasurable life, growing closer to your spouse. But unfortunately, many in the church still think sex merely represents pleasure, or really, I think, the lack thereof. How many Christian women view sex as unenjoyable and as a chore? How many Christian men use sex as a way to get that brief spike of pleasure before settling back into the unfulfilling relationship with the old ball and chain. Happens a lot, right? They may not be into one-night stands. We're Christians. But I've talked to many men who feel like it basically feels like that with their wife. I've talked to men who claim that it feels like I'm raping my wife because she doesn't want it at all. I just want the pleasure at some point, the release at some point, and it creates incredible amounts of sexual frustration. And many women seem afraid to have fun in the bedroom, and men seem to only want to please themselves through sex. And so is the woman closed off because the guy's only thinking about himself, or is the guy only thinking about himself because the woman won't loosen up? She's closed off. It's a chicken or the egg. And you can blame one another and say, well, it's their fault. If you would only do this, or if you would only do this. In reality, who's right? Maybe both, right? It's a chicken or the egg. And so we never really come around to understanding who's right and who's wrong. And the way we have to realize is maybe we're both wrong. Maybe we need to scrap it and start over and talk about these things. These things need to be worked out in order to have a good sex life. Next, we have belonging. In my opinion, this is the drive for a lot of homosexuals personally, is this idea of belonging. The homosexual population functions much like a family. They're willing to accept you even if your parents don't. We push that a lot on the younger kids of, I'll be your parents if your parents don't accept your gender choice or if they don't accept your homosexuality, right? Interestingly, this is not a hard and fast rule, but two of the markers for homosexuals that we often see is an overbearing mom and an aloof dad. Happens a lot. Overbearing mom and an aloof dad. When we work with homosexuals. Women aren't safe to them, and they want the affection and the attention of their father, so they run to a man sexually. I worked with a sex addict who's in his 60s, been a sex addict with women his entire life, and he had basically a one-night stand with a man. Could not figure out why that was the case. Well, he hated his dad. He had a horrible relationship with his dad going back into his 9, 10, 11-year-old years. His dad would hit him. And so he's having this one-night stand, late 50s, maybe early 60s, right? Can't figure out why. I said, well, what was going on with your dad at the time? He had started taking care of his dad, who was going into hospice right around that time, and he still could not connect with his dad on that emotional level. His dad was still closed off. They were trying to patch wounds, old wounds together. And so I made the connection that's like, isn't it interesting that the one time you go into having sex with a man, you're really hurting. You really want the love of your dad, still not giving it to you. And so that kind of unlocked some things when we worked through the trauma of that. And it went well from there. But the idea is there's a lot of emotional sense of belonging and needing the affection and attention of your father. So when they join this movement, they're immediately taken in. Their sexuality now represents a sense of belonging. They feel they're finally accepted as who they are. And if someone can accept them at their deepest, most intimate part, their sexuality, then you feel like you belong. Right? You feel like you belong. As the church, we have to do a better job of creating a family atmosphere where people know they are accepted with all of their struggles. No, we're not going to condone the sin, not in the least. And we most definitely hold them to a higher standard, but we have to show them why that's even more loving. Holding them to a standard is the most loving thing we can do. It's because we love you too much to let you go into sin. We love you too much to let you ruin your life. We are calling them to something much better in Christ, and we don't want them to settle for the cheap version of belonging. Their same-sex attraction doesn't push them out of the church. It means we will help them through it. We will provide for them the sense of belonging they are desperately seeking. There's a lot of people who are, I wouldn't say a lot, but there are a decent amount of people who are attracted to the same sex, and they don't know how to talk about it because it's taboo in the church. We have to be willing to listen to them and to say, let me help you with that, the same way that the man who's not but is struggling with lust toward a woman. We got to help him with that as well, right? It's the same thing, but it's just lust toward the same. And so we have to create this sense of openness, a sense of belonging, and help them. I also talked, I think, as we think about it being in the church, I've talked to a lot of singles in the church who feel like they don't belong because they are still virgins. They feel ostracized, they feel weird, there's major pressure to lose their virginity in the world, and this is operating under a similar framework, that sex helps you belong. It helps you feel less weird and more socially acceptable. In reality, sex, once again, is an amazing gift, but it's not the secret to normalcy or belonging. When sex is built up to be the greatest thing ever, it can make people feel left out. I mean, you hear this like, oh, once you just have sex, it's me. We can build it up so much that a kid can run out and have sex at 15 and be like, that's it? That's it? Like, that's supposed to be the secret of everything? No, it's not. It's not. But when we build it up in the world like that, we have a whole population in the church that feels very left out. So we have to keep it in context. We have to help singles realize that sex is great in its appropriate context. It is not everything, and it is not it is not going to bring you that sense of belonging as though everybody else that's not a virgin is kind of sitting around and talking about it. Sometimes it can feel that way. We have to do a better job of helping people feel like they belong. Next is control. When you hear about rape, it's easy to run toward the idea that the guy's a sex addict, that he's a perv, and those things very well may be true. Rape is almost always done for one thing, and it's control. It's control. They want control over that person, right? Sex is an incredibly powerful tool used to control some of the most powerful men in the world. And occasionally, you do hear stories of the upper echelon of society doing some very nefarious sexual acts. It'll come out on the news, you go, whoa, that's not good. In reality, a lot of them are doing it. Most of them just don't get caught. Power, control, money, and sex are all tied together because entire civilizations have crumbled due to things like this, right? Due to sexual control or lack thereof. And it's easy to see this as a world problem where they use sex to control people. Surely this doesn't enter the church, right? This doesn't come into the church. We don't control things like that. I'm always saddened when I hear about a wife who withholds sex from her husband so as to punish him. And it's equally as sad to hear about a husband who seeks to control every aspect of sex, who pushes his wife to fulfill his pornographic fantasies in the bedroom. You hear both of those plenty. These things absolutely happen in the church. They're driven by the fundamental understanding of what sex actually represents, a misunderstanding. If you're a man or a woman who uses sex as a bargaining chip in your marriage, stop. It's not. That's degrading what God intended to be beautiful in your marriage. There's a reason Paul tells husbands and wives to fast only for a time and only for the purpose of prayer. Because it can create sexual frustration and cause somebody to look outside the marriage and actually cause it to eat away at the very fidelity, at the faithfulness in the marriage. Way too many marriages use sex as some piece in the game that they're playing with their spouse. I'll give you sex if you clean the garage. Will you give me sex if I go to this thing with you tonight, or if I do X, Y, or Z? We're making sex all about control. Then in the bedroom, it can quickly become about who has control, how they use that control. What sexual positions, right? Or degrading things is the person made to do. Sex is driven by control, and it's miserable because no one's fulfilled. When we're simply trying to get our own needs met and trying to control the situation. And so I will say a woman often uses sex as a bargaining chip when she feels she lacks appropriate levels of control in the home, appropriate levels of control in the relationship. As we talked about yesterday, the hierarchy, the man has to be on top, but if a man is not giving the woman any control and any love and any way to kind of change her life, then oftentimes she runs to the thing that is going to be the most powerful in a man's life. I'll take away sex. And so it creates this power dynamic where the man either has to give up some of this power or she has to give back the sexual power because she can often withhold from him, right? And so it just becomes this power grab and this controlled environment that's horrible. So for the men who are dealing with that, does your wife feel heard? Does she feel valued and validated in the relationship? Does she feel represented? Because if not, it will certainly affect her view of sex, or almost always affect her view of sex. Take the time to listen to her first before getting upset. This is an excuse for the women here. This is not an excuse to withhold from your husbands, in the least. But for husbands, we have to do a very good job of trying to create that environment in our marriage. So ultimately, sex is actually about letting go of control. Any control that you have over the other person, pursuing their pleasure above yours. We're both doing that. When you're both doing it, the sex is incredible. When you're both pursuing what the other person needs and what the other person wants, then it creates something that's incredible. When you're trying to just get control out of it, it is not. Next is shame. A lot of times sex represents shame. And the world doesn't have much shame anymore concerning their sexuality and their sexual acts, but the church is full of it. We've talked about this plenty. I'm not going to spend too long on it. But it's so backwards that the church should be so shameful about this idea of sex because it's God's. We're the ones who are trying to fulfill God's design in the garden. They aren't. So they've lost shame over their acts, and we have gained what they've lost. We were intended to be naked and unashamed in the covenant relationship, but unfortunately a lot of Christians feel ashamed by anything sexual. It pushes our kids to explore through pornography, through their friends, through other places, as they say, what is this all about? What is this about, right? Everybody says this is incredible, right? They're building it up, kind of sense of belonging, right? They're building it up, so our kids run to it. So if you feel deep shame about sex, I'd encourage you to do some internal exploration around that. Figure out why that is. Is it from past experiences? Is it past teaching on it? Dig deep, try to determine what it is that causes us to feel so squirmy about it. Just, there's this shame, there's this embarrassment. If you've done something wrong sexually, you ought to feel guilty about it, but you shouldn't feel shame. Guilt and shame, the difference is guilt is, I did something bad, and I'm sorry. Shame is, I'm a bad person. There's a big difference. Most of the people in the church feel shame. I'm a bad person surrounding this, not I did something bad. When we can separate those two and help people realize that, well, I feel guilt and shame. Which one do you fully feel? Do you feel like you are a bad person, or do you feel like you've just done something bad? We have to understand the difference there. Guilt pushes you back toward God. Shame pushes you in toward yourself. So maybe it's neither for you, but the idea of sex just represents embarrassment. Why should we be embarrassed over something God created? Shame arises from our denial that sex and sexuality is a God-created gift and was created for a reason. 6, as it already came up, I did not know that. Press that. Is procreation. What does sex represent? What's the purpose of sex? I asked, as I said yesterday, when I do work with couples, especially premarital couples, I always ask this question. I almost always receive the same answer. For procreation. That's true. That's very true. One of the earliest commands in the Bible is to be fruitful and multiply. We live in a culture where kids are not celebrated. They're abhorred. Look at how many people are losing over Roe v. Wade. Like, the fact that they could no longer have free sex and then murder the result of their sex just sent people off the deep end. What kind of world do we live in where you think that you can have free sex and then it's not going to lead toward what God designed it to lead toward, which is procreation, and then get mad about the fact that you can't murder that? We live in a messed up society. But that's where we are. We hate kids. We hate kids in the church, in my opinion. How many times do you see a large family and you see, do you know what causes that? It's hilarious. I'm busting a gut. I'm sick of those things. We had a family, you guys are a family of 7. We grew up, our best friends were a family of 9, and the amount of basically snarky comments that they got growing up was horrible. We don't like kids, let's just be honest. Most people in the church, most people in the world, they hate the idea of kids. I don't believe being fruitful and multiplying was just for Adam and Eve, for Noah and his wife. It's given twice, right, in repopulating the earth. I think God shows throughout Scripture, children are a blessing, they should be welcomed.
Amen.
Our culture views the new sports car or the Italian countryside vacation as more important than children. Procreation is extremely important. However, it is not everything. This is not the only reason for sex. As I asked yesterday, if sex was just about procreation, why did God make it so enjoyable? We have to have food to eat, but I don't think I've tasted anything on earth that is as good as sexual fulfillment. Right? When you are, I love brownies, man, and I love pizza too, and that's great. But that doesn't match the high of sex, and so we say, well, why is that? And where is the term children in the book of Song of Solomon? An entire book about sex. If it's just about procreation, why is Song of Solomon not talking about them having a ton of kids? Because it's not. That's a major part of sex, but it is not everything. I think a lot of Christian marriages operate under this notion that sex should be reserved for childbearing, so they don't pursue an incredible sex life other than what is absolutely necessary. God intended you to have so much enjoyment from sex, so much fulfillment from sex, and to let it draw you closer to one another. And how amazing is it that He designed it, that in this mutual love, in this intimacy, in the celebration of love, life is created. It's unbelievable. Like, that's incredible that God designed it that way, that it is not intended to be a consequence of a one-night stand bad action. It's intended to be a consequence of two people who love each other, and out of that, life is created. It's unbelievable. Last is worthiness or love. And this last representation about sex, I think, is it represents our worthiness to be loved. If I can get them to sleep with me, that will inform me that I'm worthy of love. They wouldn't sleep with me if they didn't, right? So if I can get them to in the bedroom, then I must be somebody worthy of love. And this one I think is actually closest to the truth of sex, because sex is about a deep and abiding love. But I think a lot of people in the world view their sexuality as a way to confirm that they're worthy of being loved, instead of the other way around, right? We see this a lot in sex addiction. It's crazy how the brain works, because when we see this with porn addicts, they believe that the woman on the screen loves them. Really interesting. It matches the same on a brain chemistry level, but just in how we start talking through it. This person wouldn't be showing me the most intimate parts of themselves if they didn't. right? So it can actually fake love. They feel like they have gained a sense of love briefly for as long as they can look at porn and indulge, and then when they go away, they feel worthless, right? And so it's this extreme spikes again, right? It's that being known that they have. They get to it's knowing and being known. They get to know, but they don't have to go through the pain of being known. Everybody wants to know and to be known. And porn gets one part of the equation right. And they often think of themselves after, if they knew the real me, they'd reject me, right? But why, or what they desire more than anything is love and feeling worthy of love. And so they run to sex to get it. So most who chase worthiness of love through sex are not comfortable being fully known. If they were, they wouldn't feel unworthy to begin with. So sex at its best is when you are fully known and fully loved. That comes from a place of feeling worthy from God, right? You have to be worthy to begin with. God is the one who says you're worthy of being loved, not because of us, but because of Christ who died for us. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. In the very worst position that we were in, he died for us. That gives you a worth that cannot be taken away. Nobody can take that away. That can't be changed or formed or reformed or restructured in any way. Our worth and our value is maximum amount. Nothing we do can take that away, because at our very lowest, God gave us maximum amount. So we don't need to run to sex to prove that. Sex is about love, but just getting people to sleep with us does not make us worthy of love. Christ says you're worthy of love, not sex. So, as we get to the next slide, what does sex actually represent to God? This is described in Dr. Julie Slattery's book, God, Sex, and Your Marriage. I would come up with my own, but it's so good I thought I will just steal from her. 4 different parts: faithfulness, intimate knowing, sacrificial giving, and passionate celebration. So as we think about faithfulness, God is jealous. Okay, God is a jealous God. Why? Because he wants us to be faithful to him. Is it wrong for God to be jealous? Not in the least, right? He's God. He is calling us to have a burning, passionate love for him that drives us to faithfulness. And so he's jealous in that way. When in our marriages we bring this in, jealousy means that we are actually putting ourselves out there, being willing to be hurt. For that person to potentially not be faithful, we have to be jealous for the other person's affection, for the other person's time, not in a toxic way, as we might say, where you're jealous all the time, even when they spend 15 minutes with their parents or something. It's not about that. It's the idea of being jealous when they're flirting with somebody else. We ought to have it in our marriage because it's pushing us toward greater faithfulness. It's causing us to realize, you're mine and I want you. That's what a solid foundation is built on. And unfortunately, I think we have a lot of people who, I've never cheated on my husband. Are you faithful in your mind? If we went through your Facebook profile history, do you go back and look at the people that you hooked up with in high school, or whatever it may have been, the high school sweethearts? That happens a lot. The Facebook stalking, right? Even the emotional affairs at work. Well, I didn't actually cheat. Are you faithful in every single way with your mind and with your emotions and with your heart? Because lying and deception and not putting your spouse first begins to eat away at the idea of faithfulness. Fidelity. Giving your spouse your very best. Saying, I'm actually going to choose to push everything else to the side, everyone else to the side, even though maybe that person is maybe they love me more. Seemingly. Maybe they're prettier. Maybe they take better care of me. They make more money. Whatever it may be, you made a covenant in the eyes of God. What does that matter to you? If it matters very little, you don't understand God's covenant love for you. If it matters a lot, then that probably means you understand God's covenant, because God does not leave you. Christ has said, I will be faithful to the end, right? He has been faithful with us at all times, and we have to ask ourselves, are we faithful? This is one of the purposes of what sex ought to represent, is faithfulness. We are allowing ourselves to be fully known. We're allowing ourselves to be given over to somebody else and saying, you are my one and only. I will not share you with anybody else, and I will not be shared with anybody else. There's Christians that believe that you can get into swinging, you can get into open relationships, because that would actually do away with, and she mentioned this in her book, that there's a couple that they decided, look, I saw so much jealousy in the relationships. It created so many issues that what if we just had an open relationship in our marriage? That way there's no jealousy. Everybody can, it works out. We can have pleasure, right? As we went back to, we can have the pleasure without the jealousy, without actually being hurt by one another choosing somebody else. They made it 8 years into marriage, and it was all collapsing. They had to go to therapy and realize why God had fidelity, had faithfulness as a big part of his plan. Mm-hmm. Because jealousy actually will automatically come in. Why would it not? That person is choosing someone else over you. Sex at its best is when you have two people choosing each other, even though they could have the playing field. They could easily go out and maybe get somebody else. And they said, no, this matters to me. You matter to me. And when I know that you matter and I know that I matter, the sex is at its best. Right? But when we say, well, who actually matters? My pleasure matters, so I matter. Do you matter? Do you matter to me? Enough to stay faithful. And if we step outside the marriage in any way, including, and I don't agree with the, pornography and things like that is the same as adultery, but very similar, right? That things like pornography, they begin to chip away at the faithfulness because we're choosing somebody else. Now, I work with porn addicts. I don't believe it's just them choosing somebody else. I think it's an emotional issue that causes it, and that porn addicts very much love their spouses. They don't know how to love themselves, and therefore it leads to a lack of faithfulness. They don't know how to love their spouses. But faithfulness is huge. I got to keep moving. So, intimate knowing is the second. In what way can you be known more than when you are naked in the eyes of your spouse? In every single way. They know your struggles. They know your hurts. They know your hardships. They know everything about you. And now I am choosing to be fully naked and fully known. There's nothing better. What we do is we hide back, or even those who have sex with the lights off because they can't stand being known. They can't stand the intimate knowing and the nakedness. There's a lot of shame in that. Why should there be shame in that? Genesis 2:25, they were naked and unashamed. With our sex, our intention is to go back to the garden, to go back to what was beautiful, to go back to what was perfect. So there's this intimate knowing where you know your spouse on every level. Sex is, again, at the pinnacle of that. I've known them spiritually, I've known them emotionally, I've known them intellectually, and now I know them physically. On the deepest, most intimate level. On the part that we would feel shame in any other way, but we don't feel shame in the bedroom. This is where it's at its best. If I was to get naked in public, there'd be a deep amount of shame. There's no shame in the bedroom because we love each other. And the wife's stretch marks and the husband putting on 20 pounds after marriage and things like that are things that it's like, I've been through that journey with you. And I love that. I don't need you to look like the Victoria's Secret model. I mean, there's like skin and bones to that anyway, so I don't know if that's attractive. But I don't need you to look like that. I want you. I want to know you. The biblical knowing of sex, but also I want to know you at your most intimate. Next is sacrificial giving. We're giving of ourselves. We're giving something that we're sacrificing anybody else that we could have, right? And we're choosing our spouse. We're also sacrificing protection, basically, right? We're sacrificing safety. Because I'm giving you a part of myself I cannot take back. I'm choosing to invest in you and saying, this is what I'm giving to you. I'm giving you all of me. It's a sacrificial giving to one another. And in that way, I think sex is a holy thing, and it's basically worshipful to God. That we are taking something He has given us, a gift, and we are saying, God, we want to love each other the way that the Godhead loves one another, with that complete intimacy and complete knowing. One of the ways God has allowed us as humans to understand the complexities of heaven, I think, is through sex. So it's a sacrificial giving to one another, right? Giving of each other in ways that even when it hurts, we open ourselves up to betrayal trauma, which is really difficult to work through. And let's hope that never happens in the relationship. But we open ourselves up to those things that take sacrifice. When we hold parts of ourselves back and we keep secrets and we keep lies and we keep things from one another, that's not sacrifice. What are we sacrificing? We're protecting ourselves. I'll give you my leftovers. I'll give you my remains. I'll give you the parts of me that I want to give you. I'll give you the parts of me that make me look good. I won't give you everything, though, right? I won't give you everything.
That's right.
Because we won't sacrifice it. We're still protecting ourselves. Sex was never intended for that. Sex has to represent a sacrificial giving of ourselves, where we're willing to put it all on the line for this person. And if we're not, go figure if our sex life is horrible, because we're not sacrificially giving. Last is passionate celebration. Again, Julie Slattery is a genius. Pick up on the book. This is a celebration of the covenantal love of God more than anything. Our sex and marriage, us coming together, being fully, wholly known, is a celebration of something that God is saying, man, you have worked on it on every level. Enjoy this. Enjoy the fruits of your labor, basically, which the labor has been to getting to know one another, to sacrificing for one another, to caring for one another on the spiritual and emotional and intellectual levels. This is a celebration of your marriage. This is a celebration of the covenant you made in the eyes of God. When we look at sex as anything less, we look at sex as pleasure, we look at sex as identity or as control, we're missing the fact that it's intended to be a passionate celebration between a husband and a wife, recognizing this is how God loves us. And that sounds really weird, but this is how God loves us. Is on the deepest level. He wants us to be fully known. And he gave us on earth, this is the one way that we can be fully, holy, naked, and unashamed. It's a passionate celebration of God, calling us unto him and saying, I know you, I created you naked and unashamed. And whether you chose to go off and to engage in sexual acts that I told you not to, and you're full of shame, you can always come back to me, and heaven is going to be nothing but a passionate celebration of us being naked and unashamed in the eyes of God. Mm-hmm. That's what we're going back to. That's what this is all about, right, is the celebration. And if sex is a chore in your marriage, there ain't much celebrating, is there? There ain't much passion, is there? And there may be passion, but if the passion leaves from time to time, we need to go back to why. We need to ask ourselves, at what point do we stop celebrating our marriage? At what point do we stop celebrating the love of God, the covenant of God, the covenant we made for better or for worse, right? Mm-hmm. In sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer. We're celebrating the covenant we made with one another, saying, at our worst, I accept you, and at your best, I accept you. Because if I only accept you at your best, and I don't take your worst, you don't deserve. You know, I don't deserve that. If I can't accept you at your worst, I don't deserve your best. It's a passionate celebration. So, we got, how are we looking? Okay. I got an entire other slide to get to. You said, living out our sexual theology. So, I'm actually going to ask you a question. Why does good sex matter? Why does good sex matter? I'll take any answer.
It is an ultimate relationship that I think God wants us to have with him.
That's exactly it. What I just said right before, that's a perfect summation of that. That's why good sex matters. Why should we chase this? Why does it even matter? Why am I talking about it? Because it's the closest we will get to what heaven on earth is like with this intimate knowing, this intimate knowledge of one another. In every way, being loved, being cherished, being cared for. Somebody giving up of themselves, sacrificing themselves, choosing to be faithful to me the way God is. You want to experience God's covenantal love, get in a marriage where this is practiced. It's unbelievable. It's better than anything, right? That's why good sex matters. Why should we chase good sex? It's amazing, right? But it's only amazing in the bounds of God because he's the one that designed it. He had that from the very beginning. He said, this is what matters, right? This doesn't matter more than everything. It's not like if you don't have sex, your life will be unfulfilled. Plenty of single people who will never have sex. Doesn't mean their life is unfulfilled. They have to find the covenant relationship with God. They have to chase the intimate knowing with God, and I think that's what Paul was doing. Slattery talks about that in her book. That's what Paul was doing, is he found the intimate connection that we have, he had it with God. Not on a physical level, but on the deep knowing and understanding and chasing God, the way that we do with one another. So in a husband and wife relationship, when we have good sex, it draws us closer to God. It helps us understand him and his love and his covenant more than anything else. Because we're choosing one another, even at our very worst, right? We're choosing to stay faithful. That's why good sex matters, because it represents so much more than what the world wants it to represent. So, we're going to get into, what time is this in? 3:45? Okay. Here's good sex. Busyness. You know, when you're young and you're just starting out and you're in your honeymoon phase, it's like, this is incredible. We can have sex every day, and it's fantastic. And then life hits and you get busy. And you always tell yourself, oh, that would never happen to me. We'll prioritize. We know these things. And then you get busy and you work a ton of hours. And, you know, it's not the fact that you don't have time for it. It's the fact that you're too tired when you do have time for it because you're not prioritizing it. This is something that I think a lot of couples, especially, you know, I get busier and it's like, what's the first thing to get sacrificed? We still talk on the phone. We'll still call. What's the first thing to get sacrificed, right? When things like that happen with husbands and wives? Well, sex, when they're busy. Right? Because that takes intentional time and effort to put into one another, to desire one another, to be thinking about each other. Second, we've talked a lot about this, is lack of true intimacy. If you don't know your spouse, if you're not creating those love maps, that will certainly affect your sex life. That is a massive barrier to good, fulfilling sex. Is you got some lies, you've got some secrets, you got some things you're holding back from your spouse that maybe you're ashamed of. That will kill true intimacy. It will kill sex because you're not actually being open with the other person. How about the negative view of sex? We do this a lot, again, within the church. And with women, that's just for my husband, and I only do it because I have to. And so they have a very negative view of sex. It's a massive barrier, and it creates a lot of problems in the marriage because they don't view sex as anything good, as anything holy. They view it as, if I have to. It's not great, but if I have to. And the man has a negative view of sex because he says, well, sex basically is about pleasure, and since I don't really get pleased from it, sex is just this mirage, right? Occasionally I'll have it, but it never actually feels that good. Because I feel like, again, the idea of I'm taking advantage of my wife, or she doesn't enjoy it, or I feel like a perv, or whatever it may be. We have these negative views of sex. When we enter into the bedroom and the clothes are, the clothes come off, like, what do you see? What do you feel? If there's shame, if there's this negative view of what's about to happen, how are you going to open yourself up fully? How are you going to have good sex? You won't. What about missed expectations? Well, I thought this, and I thought that. This is why communication is so important. There's a ton of missed expectations in the bedroom of what everybody thought it was going to be like, what we thought we were going to do, what I thought you'd be comfortable with. Well, there's a lot of presupposition there. There's a lot of, again, these missed expectations of like, man, or even when you get into marriage, I thought sex was going to be this. I thought we were going to have it every day. Or it's like, man, I'm not a machine, right? That's not how this works. And we feel very frustrated because the expectations we had were one thing. It's like, that's not my expectations at all. So one of the things in premarital counseling we talk about is let's get on the same page. What are you looking for out of sex? What does it represent to you? And what are you looking for out of it? How do we know when we have reached a common conclusion of what our expectations are? Right? Then we go into the marriage, we have an understanding of what sex ought to be. Without that, we have a lot of missed expectations. We also have selfishness in the bedroom, or chasing fantasy, where the husband watched something on porn and he wants to try it in the bedroom. You're degrading your wife. If you do that, stop. It is not a time for selfishness. It is not a time for, well, let's do this, and like, I'm not comfortable. It's like, well, it doesn't matter. You're going to do it. It's selfish. That's not loving. That's not caring for your wife. There ought to be this selflessness. Now, for on the wife's end, it's easy for the guy to be selfless and be like, I'd like to do this. And the wife's like, no, not going to do it. Not going to do it. Not going to do it. For the wife, explain your boundaries. Explain why, right? There's communication involved with things like this as to, maybe the guy's not trying to be selfish. Maybe he's trying to explore ways to have more fun in the bedroom. In my opinion, there's multiple ways you can do it. Obviously, you're not bringing anybody else in. It's fidelity. It's in the bedroom, but I don't think there's a reason God didn't give us a whole lot of parameters about what happens inside the bedroom. Because I think it's about enjoying one another in whatever possible ways that you want, as long as it's not drawing you away from one another and away from God. And so we have this idea of the selfishness. On the one hand, sometimes it's clamming up and saying, I don't want it. And on the other hand, it's like, well, let's do everything. And then it creates this issue. And it creates this fantasy. If I saw this one time, let's try it. That's wrong. Is your spouse comfortable with it? Have you talked through these things? Does it create a sense of enjoyment for both of you, specifically for your spouse? And if not, that's not appropriate. Physical pain or discomfort. Of course, I'm not going to take too long on this, but this is a real issue. If that is, obviously, there's doctors you can go to. If it is something like that, I would say chase. If you cannot fully feel comfortable, chase intimacy in every other way. Again, sex is the outflowing. That's the pinnacle. It's the outflowing of a life lived with intimacy. That's fantastic. You don't have to have it. You can get so much enjoyment from just getting to know your spouse, just getting to love and appreciate your spouse, knowing them on the spiritual, emotional, and intellectual levels. Attempting, different things to help with the pain and such. Those are some things that I think are important to try. Past trauma, we talked a lot about this, right? If there's past trauma, work through it. That's an individual issue. You can help your spouse work through it sometimes by being there for them. Most people don't have the ability to really help process their spouse's past trauma, nor do I think it's smart to try. That would be something to really get into therapy for if you're really struggling with past trauma and it's destroying your sex life. Negative emotions toward your spouse. If you got them in the depreciation box or the depreciation room where everything they do is horrible, well, what are you going to do, right? You're going to show up in the bedroom and now I'm going to be naked and unashamed? No, I can't stand you right now. I want to, first fix what's going on. Talk about it. Work through the negative emotions. This may have been building for a long, long time. Maybe been building for a couple of years. Maybe if you're feeling frustrated in the relationship and you're saying, well, hey, sex will work it through. Sex will help us build more intimacy and that will cause us to work through our issues. Wrong way. Turn it upside down. Recognize that you have to work through the emotions first in order to unlock a good sex life. Negative emotions toward your spouse, any bitterness that you build will absolutely affect it. Physical and emotional exhaustion, this goes along with the busyness, right, of just you're not prioritizing, you're not making time for it. This also, if we're allowing ourselves to get physically and emotionally exhausted, prioritize your sex life. It does matter. It does matter. It ought to matter. If it doesn't matter, again, work through why it doesn't matter to you. Low self-esteem and poor body image. A lot of people do this. Again, that's kind of the sex with the lights off. Like, I don't want to be seen. I don't want to be known. That's not what's going to create a good sex life. Where it's like, well, that's just, I'll let you get the pleasure out of it. No, part of the pleasure is being known. Part of the pleasure is recognizing that, even in my low self-esteem, my poor body image, my husband really wants me, or my wife really desires me. That's incredible. That's amazing. Even at my lowest, my wife very much desires, right? That type of thing. This will, if we bring this into the marriage and we say, oh, I don't want you to see me, or I don't want this, or I don't want that, how are you intending to have good sex? You won't, right? You won't. Poor communication or issues with initiating. This can definitely be an issue of, well, who's supposed to initiate? Or I've initiated the last 6 times, right? Whatever it may be, communicate. Poor communication leads to this. It's the expectations, it's all sorts of things like that. And we are having a flight. Okay. Common beliefs on sex. You should have sex before marriage to make sure you're sexually compatible. Test drive the car, right? Anybody heard this? Yeah. Test drive the car. Having been through this would be interesting. Having been through this, why is this wrong? This makes so much sense, does it not? I mean, if I want to buy a car and I'm about to spend 30 grand on a car, you bet I'm going to test drive that thing. They'll be lucky if I get it back, right? Just go. Why would we not?
Well, the whole goal is to see if you're compatible. If you start from the bottom and work your way up, you'll be compatible when you get to the top.
Beautiful. That is perfect. That is perfect. Couldn't have said it better myself, so I won't even. Everybody hear that? That was really good. You'll be compatible. This idea of sexual compatibility, I got into marriage, we're just not compatible. Are you serious? Like, you've been married for 2 months. How can you be sexually compatible? People take 60 years to work this. Like, no, you're not always going to be perfectly sexual compatible. Are there those that just get you sexually? I've worked with guys that had been in relationships in the past, they got married now, and they love their wife so much, but they still fantasize about the last one because the sex was just that good. The sex was so good, and they really, really struggle with it. And so what you have to do is, like, stop focusing on just that and recognize you were in sin, you were not a Christian at the time, you were doing everything wrong, and here you're in a covenant relationship with somebody who loves you at your worst. That woman did not. So you really start to get the mind wrapped around the fact that sexual compatibility is so much more than just, hey, we click immediately. You may click immediately, and they could be the wrong person. Then what? You've given them a part of yourself you can never take back. Well, we had great sex. Who cares? They don't love you. They don't love you. They don't take care of you emotionally. They're not leading you closer to Christ because they're sleeping with you before marriage. They don't care about your spirituality, and all we care about is, are we sexually compatible? That's weak. That's literally the last thing we should be thinking about is whether we're sexually compatible. You will be compatible if you work together on creating a place of safety in the marriage.
So in your experience, so couples, people that have sex before they get married, say one's Christian, one's not, they're both Christians or whatnot, because hormones,
sure.
happen. So if they do have sex before marriage, in your experience, how does it affect the marriage afterwards? Because like yesterday you said put a ring on it, and someone said not an engagement ring, that doesn't count. Because people are, we cross that boundary. It's people that have done it before they get married. How does it affect them? Whether one's Christian, one's not, if both Christian, how does it affect the marriage afterwards? Or does it, in your experience, at all?
It does, and differently. It depends. It kind of depends on what traumas they're taking in or what ideas they're taking in with it. For two Christians who do it, it takes shame in the marriage, and it creates a lot of issues to work through. Of feeling, especially if one feels bad and one doesn't, whatever it may be. It can create a spiritual issue there. It can create an emotional issue. For those who are in the world, most of the time the guy in the world doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, so you're again kind of at spiritual odds. One's feeling very guilty about it and one's not. So when you come into the marriage, yeah, it affects it in that way, where one is still working through the shame of the sex and the other is like, oh, hey, we're fine. Well, yeah, that creates a incompatibility there that has to be worked through. So does it affect? Yes. The other thing about putting a ring on it, I'll just say this. We have for so many people, they have sex with their girlfriend and we go, oh, you better marry that girl. What are we doing? Like, you made a mistake. That doesn't mean you have to pursue the marriage. I got another one right now. I mean, I got all sorts of plans. I got another one right now who's dealing with the same exact thing. He had sex previously, felt horrible, rushed into the marriage, and now is like, feels very stuck in a marriage that he does not feel good about. And he kind of feels bamboozled. He feels like he was pushed into something he was not ready for, because it's like, you have to. You're contractually obligated. You had sex with this person, so you better marry him. We ruin a lot of people's lives and create a lot of unhappy marriages based on it. It's a sin. Repent from your sin. Don't just run to it and put a ring on it. If you are in a relationship, in a committed relationship, you've already got the engagement ring, and you're taking 2 years to get to the altar, and you're really, really, really burning in your passion, and you know this is the right person, get married. Put the ring on it. Stop tempting yourself. Stop making it the most difficult thing to do. That's the difference there. So I'm not saying we should push people in, and you're not saying that either, but I just wanted to clarify. I'm not saying we push people into it just because I think we can ruin a lot of lives that way. Even when there's kids involved. Even when. I'm not of the, I think you should work toward that in the relationship. If you thought enough of them to have sex with them, to have a kid together, see if you can work on that relationship. Don't just run from it. See if you can work on the relationship to the point where marriage is possible. But if not, we got to not shame people into doing something that might ruin their lives. But they will have consequences of raising that kid. Sex in marriage is mainly to meet the man's physical needs. What's wrong with this?
Selfish.
Good. Selfish, yeah. What else?
You know, the God's design.
Right. Is the man or the woman sexual being? Both. We have to get around this idea that the man is a sexual being, the woman is an emotional being. Right? Wrong. They're both emotional and they're both sexual. They may externalize it in different ways. The man may be driven more physically through sexuality. That's not to say that the woman is not a sexual being or the man is not an emotional being. They just externalize it differently. And some men can swing the pendulum too far and cut off all their emotional needs and be like, I'm not an emotional guy. I don't cry. But we're emotional people. God created us that way, and that's okay. But we're also to be men who are to lead, right? So we don't want to just be blubbering all the time. But it's important to understand our emotions, to understand we both have physical needs. And sex is about us desiring one another and us being together in a committed union, a committed covenant, and loving each other. What part of that does a woman not need? Needs all of it. Next one, a wife needs to have sex anytime her husband asks so as to safeguard the marriage. Well, he's going on a long trip, we better have sex so he doesn't sleep around. What's wrong with that?
Selfish.
Yeah, selfish. Yeah, right? This is actually a common belief that we have to safeguard the marriage so as to do it. So if I can have sex before, then that'll make sure that he's not thinking about any other woman. If your husband steps out after a 3-week trip because, well, you didn't have sex with him before, shame on him. Yeah. Faithfulness and fidelity has to matter more than that. You're not safeguarding your marriage, and if he does step out on you, oh man, if I had only just had sex with him, I would have safeguarded the marriage. And so we shame people into having sex. We shame people into, you need to do it so as to make sure that your husband's not looking at somebody else. You serious? That sets the bar for the man down here and sets the bar for the woman up here. You have to make sure you're giving him this. And husbands, hey, take from your wife and try not to sleep with anybody else. You kidding? This is wrong on so many levels because it puts it upsets the hierarchy. It pushes shame and reasons for sex to, instead of being, again, that celebration, instead of being a beautiful thing together, it pushes it into, I have to do it so as to make sure that you don't step out on me. That's no reason to have sex. Sex is the primary way to build intimacy. Other way around, right? I'm not going to spend long on that. Other way around. It is the outflowing of an intimate life. When we make it the primary way to build intimacy, we flip the pyramid on its head, right? I don't even know who, yeah. Whatever. We take it and we flip it on its head, right? Which makes it wobbly. Means that sometimes it's a hit and sometimes it's a miss. Sometimes it builds intimacy, no doubt. It draws closer to one another. God has designed certain things, where it's also in the Slattery book, in that one, where you actually forget some of the negative feelings about your spouse when you start getting aroused and when you have sex. Why is that? Because it's intended to pull us back together. It's intended to push us to one another. So is it wrong to build intimacy? No, it absolutely will build intimacy. It's not the only outflowing, but if we're trying to fix all of our emotional needs, all of our spiritual issues, all of the inconsistencies in our marriage by running to sex, we're doing it wrong. It will build intimacy. It does push us back toward one another, but it should not be the primary way that we do it. Men always have the higher sex drive. This is a very big fallacy. This is wrong. Just to put it bluntly, it's wrong. That's not always the case. I work with plenty who do not have the higher sex drive in their marriage. They feel ashamed because, well, I'm supposed to be the man. I'm supposed to want it every day, and my wife wants it more than me. So you start dealing with shame. You start dealing with all sorts of things because we've told the guys. Has anybody heard this statistic that guys think about sex every 6 seconds? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Does any guy here, raise your hand please, if you think about sex every 6 seconds? I will be impressed. Nobody does that. Come on. And you hear this, and you hear, wow, when I get into marriage, my husband's going to want it all the time. And you get into a marriage where the guy doesn't want it that much, and it's like, what, is he not a man? Right? Or something wrong with me? I want it more than... We're hurting so many people by playing into these stereotypes. The man's always, he's playing a shotgun and whatever else, and he comes in and he's drinking his beer and he just wants to sit down and he's a slob and he sits on the couch and it's like, look, I have more shoes than my wife does. I like things clean. I make the bed more than she does. It matters to me. What, do I not fit into the stereotype? We have to get away from the stereotypes because everybody's different. There's one thing therapy's taught me, is that we're all going through something and we're all different. Don't ever put people in a box and say, this is the way that it is. Because you're always going to come around to realizing that person's different. And even if they do the same exact thing, they have different motivations. Why do we put them all in a box and say, this is what it is? It's not good. It's not healthy. Men do not always have the higher sex drive. And it brings, again, shame and frustration and things into the marriage when we push that too much. Men need the physical while women need the emotional. I already talked about that. We are all emotional beings. We're all physical beings, maybe in different ways, no doubt. I'm not denying science, but I am saying that it's wrong to say men are not emotional, and it's wrong to say women are not physical. You've heard the crock pots versus the microwaves, right? Once again, I don't ever do the broad brush in that way and say, well, this is the way that it is, because it can be opposite, but women are more like the crock pot. They take longer to heat up. That's why foreplay and things like that are so important to the wife. Because maybe she's not as physical, but she wants to feel that intimacy, that love, the cherishing, you took time and you thought about me. And the man may not need it as much, but don't think that he's not emotional and that doesn't play a role. Husbands who want sex every night should expect their wives to oblige lest they stand in opposition to 1 Corinthians 7. What's wrong with that one? Now we're bringing scripture here. What's wrong with 1 Corinthians, or with that understanding of 1 Corinthians 7? Don't withhold, right?
First of all, it's controlling. And
right.
That's not what the scripture is intended to say.
That's right. It's the husband trying to control, right? And we can throw this in their face. We can throw scripture and go, gotcha. Don't ever throw scripture in somebody's face and say, gotcha. Lovingly talk them through it as to why maybe you think that's wrong. More than anything, what should somebody do in this situation? Communicate. That's exactly it. Figure out why your wife doesn't want to oblige. Figure out why your wife doesn't want it all the time. Figure out why you do want it all the time. As I said a day or two ago, in my opinion, which is what I'm hoping to actually write a thesis on for PhD, what I want to talk about is I think people in their marriages who have more sex, who want sex all the time, are emotionally broken, and those who have an understanding at the appropriate level of understanding what sex is all about don't have sex as much. That doesn't mean they don't have sex all the time. It means, or that they never have sex. It means that when they're in the emotionally appropriate level, you don't need sex 5 times a day. I think if you do, you need to work through something that's pushing you toward that sex. Sex represents something to you that you're desperately lacking if that's the case. What does sex represent? You have to figure that out. So, should they expect their wives to oblige? No. If you're a wife who is always in opposition, that comes with its own issues, and now you really are in opposition to 1 Corinthians 7. Now you really are using it as control or whatever else. And if you don't feel safe, communicate. Communicate. We are almost done. Women should be able to deny their husband sex for as long as they need so as to feel comfortable. What would we say to that? Is that wrong? Here's the question. What does this mean? What's that represent? What can help you be more comfortable? Because I know plenty of marriages where the woman just, I'm waiting to feel comfortable. I'm waiting until I feel comfortable. It's been 3 years. When are you going to get comfortable? Right? When are you going to get comfortable? Meanwhile, the guy is sex starved, and the man is struggling maybe with porn addiction or struggling with whatever else. Women don't just have sex with their husband to get on a porn addiction. That's not the point of a porn addiction. That will not pull him out of the porn addiction. But we can absolutely push our spouses toward those things when it's an indefinite time. I'm just not comfortable. If you're not comfortable after a long time, maybe there's past trauma. Maybe you've been abused and raped or molested or whatever it may be, and sex is uncomfortable. You need to work through that. Sex is worth having with your spouse. So if you're a wife that's struggling with that, figure it out. Communicate. Why are you uncomfortable? What's pushing you toward being uncomfortable?
It's part of the doghouse effect. The husband did something wrong, so I can put him in the doghouse. He could sleep on the cold side of the bed.
That's right. That's exactly it. And then what does that cause the husband to feel? Well, men aren't emotional. They don't feel it. Yeah, absolutely, we do.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the emotion really comes out. Most of the time, we shoot straight through the hurt. We go right into anger. Anger is a surface level emotion, so we always want to deal with the anger. Why is he so angry? How about you dig deeper and figure out? He's either fearful or he's hurt. Almost always in anger. In a deep sense of anger. There's frustration, or if I nitpick you, yeah, there's frustration. Most of the time, a deep anger comes from hurt or it comes from fear. In this situation, if you're feeling that from your husband, figure it out. But I would say, figure out why you don't feel comfortable. Pursue getting comfortable in the marriage. Talk about it, communicate about it, go to therapy for it. It's worth fighting for. We've already established good sex is worth fighting for. What are we going to do to fight for it? Last, not least, sex is a biological need. I will die if I don't have sex. No, you won't. No, you won't. There's a lot of people that operate like this, though. If I don't have it, then, that's kind of the purpose of life, right? That's where we move it toward the identity. We move it toward, that's where we get pleasure. That's where we get acceptance. All of these come into this. It's a biological need. You can go your entire life without having sex. Jesus did 33 years. There's other people. Monks do it. There's other people that are pursuing love from God. They're pursuing their covenant relationship with God. You will not die if you don't have sex. Is it a beautiful thing? Yes. It's a wonderful, amazing gift from God that when done appropriately, it's incredible. It is not a biological need. When we treat it as such, we miss out on the beauty of what it actually is. Okay, we are 6 minutes past. We're going to come back in 9 minutes and do last presentation. Thanks.